Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix Writers Room. I'm Liz Booker, and I'm continuing my conversation with author Maggie Shipstead about her novel, Great Circle. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the Literary Aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. So in the first half of our conversation, you talked quite a bit about your writing life and kind of how you crafted this book, but I just want to go deeper. And so let's start with when you decided, like you said, you were in school, you decided to kind of go the English track. Like, how did that all play out for you as a writer? How did you develop your craft? What challenged you on that path?
As I mentioned, I went to Harvard and I got there and I thought maybe I'll be an anthropologist. And so I took one, intro to social anthropology class, and I was like, this is not for me. Like, you're not allowed to judge people if you're an anthropologist. And that's a crucial part of my existence. And so just looking at the course catalog, I realized, every course I wanted to take was an English course. And as I said, always been a reader. And so I switched to English, and then sophomore year, kind of on a whim, I took a fiction writing workshop with Lan Samantha Chang, who ended up becoming the director at Iowa the year before I went, I think. And it was interesting, but I was like, starting, you just have no idea what you're doing. It's just in a dark cave with no light. And so I really didn't have a sense of, oh, this is my life now, or, oh, I could do this. Like, neither of those things seemed evident to me. And then my junior year, Zadie Smith came to teach. And I think it was the first time she'd ever taught. And she was like 30 and was deeply unconvinced by the idea of teaching creative writing. She was so mean to us, and which I sort of loved her for. Like, she'd give us these little exercises and then be like, check minus. Kind of like a check minus. We were all kind of like, excuse me, madam, like, we are Harvard students. Like, what are you doing? But also, like, I don't think she understood that we were like 19-year-old, like, we were bad. She wrote her first book at 23 and was amazing. And but I found it very inspiring. And actually, there was also a weird story where you had to apply to her class. And so the day they posted the class list, I went and I wasn't on the list. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm not good at this fiction writing thing. And then later someone was like, oh, congratulations on getting into Zadie's class. And it turned out she was also teaching a critical class, and I had looked at the wrong list. And so I was in class, but I think if that person hadn't told me, I wouldn't have known, I wouldn't have taken the workshop. And I feel like I might not have become a writer. It was a real, like, sliding doors moment. So I did that. And then my senior year, I applied to write a creative thesis. So instead of writing a critical thesis, I wrote a collection of short stories. I graduated. I was living with friends in Boston, no idea what to do. I was working part-time at a law firm, because if you're verbal, people are like, oh, obviously you're going to be a lawyer. And so kind of on a little bit of a whim, I applied to Iowa thinking I won't get in, but next year I'll do my research. I'll apply to other programs. And then I got in. And so suddenly I had, structure and money for 2 years. I moved out to Iowa, and really there was where it started to seem like maybe this was viable. Just being in that program, which is sort of notoriously competitive. I'm not sure what it's like now, because Sam has now been the director for a long time and has sort of reshaped it in some ways, but the funding was competitive. The atmosphere is a little bit competitive. It's a pretty big program. So that kind of worked for me as a writer. I don't think I was really my best, like, human self while I was there. I was also pretty young. I was 23 and 24. So then I finished, and as I said, I had this third-year fellowship. So I wrote the first draft of Seating Arrangements, my first novel, and then applied for this fellowship at Stanford, where you're in a creative writing workshop again for 2 years. And so then I went back to workshop, and it was the same thing. It was, like, incredibly helpful and also kind of challenging, sort of in a spiritual sense. And then after that, I had 1 year before seating arrangements came out. I sold it in between my 2 years at Stanford, and it's usually like a 2-year lead time. And so I had this year where seating arrangements was coming out, but I was pretty much done with it. And people were like, were you Eat, Pray, Loving? I spent a month in Bali. I spent 3 months in Paris on a writing fellowship and a month in Edinburgh. And that's when I wrote Astonish Me and sort of sold it right before seating arrangements came out. So I was pretty charmed. Like, I think my career is like very classic in terms of the institutions I was part of, and everything went pretty well. And then, you know, the years in the desert when I was writing Great Circle were both really good for me, I think, and also just tough because you're sort of like completely disconnected from this world of writing and publishing books and just hoping this thing will come together. Like, I didn't even know how it ended. And so I didn't have a contract for it. Nobody was reading it. And so I just had to kind of have faith in it for a long time.
Wow. Well, that's an incredible story. You know, I find it interesting hearing from you, and I heard this in my writers circles before, especially. So the program that I did was the Vermont College of Fine Arts program, writing for children and young adults. And for me, so I live in this very competitive world, and very critical world in the military and aviation. But that children's writing program is very gentle and tender and supportive. And so it was something that I looked forward to, that contrast in culture of like, I can, because here's a little tip. I can hover a helicopter at night over the water, but writing is scary. It feels very vulnerable. It's like you're unzipping your belly and letting people see your insides. And it was so terrifying to expose myself, especially after living an adult life in an environment where creativity in that way is not encouraged. Emotional expressions are not encouraged. So I had a lot of work to get out of that. And so the Vermont College of Fine Arts provided this beautiful contrast where I could come out of my sort of emotional shell very safely and tenderly. I don't think I would have survived a critical writing program like in the way that I've heard these adult writing programs are. I'm just so surprised by that, just because my experience was so different.
Well, I was going to say, I could see how the two sort of halves of your life would feed each other. Like, I'm sure the discipline of your military and pilot life serves you well as a writer. And then I think, it is a really vulnerable thing to do. So I'm glad you found the right program. And I mean, Iowa, I think part of it is that most people going into it think they have a vision of themselves as sort of literary luminaries. And I will say I came into it without that. Like, I'd never had this long held vision of myself on a typewriter in an attic, you know? And I think that was really helpful for me. So I was sort of just falling into it, and I didn't have this ironclad like dream, but you know, everyone's coming in hoping for sort of the same really unlikely destiny. And so everything seems like a sort of referendum on if you're going to make it. You know, like, who publishes a short story in this tiny journal? Well, they have a leg up now. And actually, in retrospect, like, none of it matters. And people write their books at all different times in life and through all different processes. But when you're sort of in this tiny little bubble in this big college town and maybe drinking too much, I don't know, hypothetically, there's sort of nothing to do except workshop and just drink Pabst Blue Ribbon. And it was hard. But there are, I think, as to your point, there are so many different writing programs now, and there are lots of different atmospheres that people can seek out.
Yeah. You mentioned sort of this vision that maybe most writers had. And do you feel like this book kind of puts you in that category, even though you maybe didn't envision it that way? The success of this book kind of puts you there?
I mean, really, by the time I was done with Iowa and at Stanford, I was really ambitious for myself. And my first novel, Seating Arrangements, was a New York Times bestseller. And I won a literary prize in the UK. So kind of from the get-go, I think, I felt more like, okay, I'm here. But it's funny. It's like there's no permanent sense of security. Like even after, Great Circle, you still, as I've said with my struggles to write my next book, everything's shifting. Like Great Circle is a finalist for the Booker Prize, and it's hard not to go like, but I didn't win. So like, what do I have to write to win? But that's the worst way that you could possibly set out to write a book. It doesn't work. You have no control over any of this stuff. It's all very human. It's people choosing these things. Yeah. The only thing you can do is really write what comes from you and be both kind to yourself and rigorous with your work. And that's a really hard, line to stick to sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I was going to say earlier is just what an inspiration you are. I'm never going to be as prolific or accomplished as you are. I don't aspire to be. I have certain topics that I wanted to explore. I want to sell those books and get them in front of young people. Those are my goals. But especially for a young person who is, starting off in writing, who is in school, you are just such a role model for them in the way that, Eileen Collins, the first female astronaut pilot, is an inspiration for us. So it is wonderful. I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to hear from you, to hear your stories and to learn, a little bit about what this process looks like for a professional writer. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
Some technicality stuff. So you were in school, you had a book that was, that you wanted to get published. Did you have an agent? How did you find your agent? Do you still have that agent? Tell us about that in your life.
Sure. This is another not necessarily super relatable aspect of the story, but at Iowa, agents will come just sort of fishing for clients. And I would never have gone to a meeting with an agent. I had a couple finished short stories, but I didn't really feel like I had anything to show anyone. And the administrator of the program for decades was this woman, Connie Brothers, and she was kind of like a wizard. And so she called me one day and she was like, do you have a car? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, do you have an agent? I was like, no. She was like, okay, go pick this woman up at the airport. So I drove to Cedar Rapids to pick up this agent who was coming to meet people. And so this was my agent, Rebecca Gradinger, and who's at UTA now. And, we got along, and she was like, do you have any stories? And I was like, kind of, So I sent her this really long story that she read on her BlackBerry, which said, dates it. And then, she just started sending out short stories for me while I was writing Seating Arrangements. And that gave us good practice sort of having a bit of an editorial relationship. So she's really my first reader, and she'll give me feedback, and I'll usually do another draft or two. And then, if it's a story, she sends it out, or with a novel, then this is a different technical question I'm sure we'll get to, but then it goes to my editor. But she's been my agent for about 16 years. And it's so kind of like marrying the first person you go on a date with. Yeah. I was just like, you'll do. And I love her. She's a great agent for me, a great reader for me, and a really close friend at this point. And it's very intimate. She knows a lot about my petty grievances, and she knows a lot about my dreams, and she knows about my finances. And there's a lot of trust there. And not everyone has that relationship with their agent. I think we're probably in the minority. But that was a real stroke of good fortune.
Yeah, I mean, I see why you would say that that's not relatable. However, there are ways, obviously going to a program like you did, going to a program like I did, talking about, ours too was one in which agents would come fishing for fresh meat. But also putting yourself in other situations. I've heard people talk about volunteering to help out at writers conferences, be the volunteer that helps the authors, that goes and picks them up at the airport, and or the agents, goes and picks them up at the airport, and putting yourself in those situations where you can get to establish a rapport with somebody before you're asking them to read your work. So I think there are ways to make that magic happen, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's true. And one thing I would emphasize too is even though my sort of trajectory is very, classic, you know, I think there's this perception of the publishing world as being closed, but it's really not. Like, I think agents are more excited when they see something from someone who didn't go to Iowa, you know, like they're sort of over like people with these really traditional MFAs. And they're always interested in an interesting backstory. And I mean, I skipped the part where you send out 50 letters and have to wait for responses, which is, I know, a real burden on a lot of people and can be really slow and frustrating, but it's certainly, that time can be really well spent, I think. And there are lots of paths to publishing work.
Yeah. And so you also hinted that we would talk about this. So let's talk about it. So then the relationship from there, after your agent has your work, and you mentioned that you sold Great Circle when it was much larger than it is now, and that editorial process happened with the publisher. Can you just talk about that back and forth, that relationship, how long it took? Tell me about that. And also, I'm so curious to know, like, does your ego get in the way? Like, you know, when they're telling you have to cut things and change things, and how much of that tension, you know, is involved?
That's always a question. So I've been with the same editor at Knopf for all 4 of my books.
Nice.
With Seating Arrangements, which was published in 2012, and we sold it in 2010. My agent and I had heard from this really famous editor who had read one of my short stories and was like, you know, I'd really like to publish her novel. And so Rebecca sent her Seating Arrangements, and there was like on a week exclusive. So only this editor had it. And there was like this long silence. And then on the 8th day, Rebecca sent it out to other editors. And at that point, this original editor came back and was like, I will buy Maggie's unwritten, unconceived of second novel on the condition we put this novel in the basement and like never speak of it again. And the same day, my editor at Knopf was like, I must have this book. I want to work with this writer forever. And we were like, what does this all mean? You know,
Wow.
Like this one editor we were excited about thinks this book should be set on fire. And this other editor who's, you know, also wonderful and has this amazing track record. My editor's name is Jordan Pavlin, wants to buy it. And we were like, well, we're going to go with the one who wants to buy it. So yeah, she's pretty old school in the way she gives notes. Like my agent will call me and we'll talk through it. And Jordan will, like 6 months will go by after we sell the book. And then I get a package in the mail and it's the manuscript marked up by hand. And also this sort of like 3-page size 4 font letter sort of detailing her thoughts about it. And that's what it's been with all 3 of my novels. And I think Great Circle, we did the most rounds. We probably did 4. And some of that was just cutting. The ego question is interesting. I mean, that's something I'm always asking myself. Like, am I resistant to this because it hurts my feelings, or am I resistant to this because I'm right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and the Jordan's a really sort of, some editors are all business, you know, and they're just like, how can we make this book so it sells more books? And that's not Jordan's thing at all. But that is, you know, a concern on their end, like for how long Great Circle was when I sold it. And Great Circle, we sold on a 500-page partial. Like we sent Jordan 500 pages and she was like, how much more is there? And we were like, no, don't worry about it. Like not many. It was like 480 more pages.
That's awesome.
And so I'm always trying to sort of tease that out. Like, what do I dig in about and what do I agree on? And often both Jordan and Rebecca will point out things that I knew in my heart of hearts weren't working. And I was just hoping no one would notice, you know?
I think I have said those very words.
Yeah. You're just like, it's probably fine. And they're like, this isn't fine. You're like, okay. And Jordan, my editor, she really staunchly refuses to make a prescriptive suggestion, even when I ask for it. So she'll point out a problem, but she doesn't care how I solve it. So with seating arrangements, for example, she was sort of, there was a point in the book where she was like, I'm tired of this guy's point of view. And that book uses a lot of different point of views and points of view. And she's like, we need someone else. But it's a moment in the narrative when everyone's asleep. It's like the middle of the night. And I was sort of like, I'm not really sure how to do that. And she was like, well, good luck. And so I ended up waking up a character and writing a very short chapter that accomplished what she wanted. And I did improve the book. I could tell it improved the book. So, things like that. And with Great Circle, she was sort of like concerned about the ending of Hadley, the movie star's arc. And we really went round and round. I was like, can you give me just a for instance of what you're thinking would help here? And she was sort of like, nope. And so eventually I like asked, I think my mom actually had a good suggestion that solved the problem. But yeah, it's not easy. And when Rebecca, my agent, first read Great Circle, we talked about it for 8 hours over, I think, 3 or 4 days. And even though it was friendly and I appreciated all her points, it was incredibly stressful. There's just no way around it.
Does part of you hold back when you're writing because other people are going to have their hands in your work? Like, do you, because this is something that I realized was happening for me, that there was a part of me that was like, well, I'm going to write this whole thing. Somebody else is going to, like if I find an agent, then they're going to give me, suggestions if they're editorial, and then it's going to go off to the publisher and they're going to want me to make changes. And so I don't need to get it to 100%. I just need to get it to like 80%. And I had the epiphany that I was doing that at some point. And I was like, okay, no, I own this. This is mine. And am like actually questioning, based on all of the interviews that I've done and the exposure that I've had to the independent publishing world, like trying to make decisions. But I'm curious to know that you, somebody who writes such a large volume, who has published several books and knows that there is going to be this process that might be slightly painful later, do you hold back in your writing at all?
No, I think I might go the other way. Like it's sort of the same idea, but I think in some ways I write past what I think they'll let me publish. Like some of it was the length of Great Circle, some of it was the style, and all my books have had some element of that. Like Astonish Me has a pretty complicated structure and it had to be simplified in edits. And I think seating arrangements did too, in a way, although it's been such a long time. So I think, yeah, I do like a little more like razzle dazzle that I think they'll let me actually like leave in the finished book.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I try not to think about readers very much at all. I think that's part of why I'm struggling now, is because just having done it so many times, it's really difficult to shut that out. I do think about like readers' cognition, I guess, sort of, is this is what I'm trying to say legible, both in the explicit, language of the book, but also in sort of the underlying thought, I guess. And that can be distracting, I think, sometimes. And is this going too fast? Like, how do I parcel out this information in a way that works for people's brains? I think so then I start to need... Traditionally, I've written a full draft of my books before anyone read anything. And then this book too, I've shown to my agent, my husband, these sort of pieces of it, because I just haven't felt confident that I have the right flow of information. So you can see a lot of things are sort of in flux right now. But, another thing I was thinking about with your question is sometimes like with, Great Circle's been out for 2 years, and I'll do like a book event or something, and someone will be like, do you want any criticisms? And I'm like, no. And it's not because I can't handle it. It's because A, I can't do anything about it.
Yeah. Yep.
B, I don't think people understand the sheer magnitude of criticism that one takes up to that point.
Correct, yeah.
It's like from the agent, from the editor, copy edits, proofs, all of that is more criticism of one's writing than most people get in a lifetime. And then you start getting newspaper reviews and trade publication reviews. And it's a lot, that's a lot of voices coming at you. And some of it in some ways is helpful long-term, but most of it's just kind of reflective of who it's coming from. And so, it's something that I think people who want to write should actually think about. Like, I had this correspondence with this woman for a while who I think was a classmate of mine and really wanted to do an MFA. And so every year for a few years, she would be like, I'm getting ready to apply. Would you read my application? I'd say, yeah, sure. And then she'd freak out and be like, I can't, it's not ready. I can't send it. And so finally, after the third year, I said, I got to be honest with you. This is the easiest it's ever going to be. Like, you're showing this to someone friendly and there's sort of no stakes. And once you get there, you're going to sit in a room in silence with 12 people while they pick apart your work. Yep. And then if that goes well, then you're going to have a bunch of agents and editors reject you. And then you're going to have people say whatever they want in newspapers. And there are personalities for whom this is harder and personalities for whom it's easier.
Yeah. Yeah. It as I said before, like I could take criticism professionally at work and in the aircraft, but that professionalism or that criticism was about my performance. It wasn't about me and my creativity, which a lot of the critique that you get as you're writing and as you're going through these programs is more about the craft, hopefully, but someone might reject my ideas. So that's a very scary thing. Yeah.
And then you go, are they right? Or am I right? And it's, and not to say that it doesn't bother me. Like, I think Astonish Me got a pretty negative review in the New York Times, which I actually thought was a really unfair review. Like, there's a review that someone could have written that would have been genuinely devastating. And this I just thought was weird and petty and mean. And they held it the book had been out for 3 months before they ran it. So then it came out on like my birthday.
Oh, terrible.
I was like 30. Yeah. And I just like stared at the ocean. I was mad about it. I'm like still mad about it 10 years later. So, it is just a part of the job. And
when I started this project, I called it the Aviatrix Book Review. And because the impetus behind this was during COVID, wanting to connect with other women in aviation, because I was feeling super isolated and was kind of running out of like my inspiration to continue writing my own story, right? So I was like, I'm going to connect with everyone. And I'd had in my head like this idea that I would write a comprehensive review of all the books ever written about women in aviation. And so I was like, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to start a book club. And won't that be fun? And then what happened was I started making friends with the authors. And I was like, I'm no longer in the business of reviewing books by people, that are already published. Like, if you want my critique on your work, tell me before you publish it, because I'm not going to do it after it's published. It's not helpful. So nothing we can do about it.
It can be very helpful in progress, but I know some authors will really take a stand. They're like, stop tagging me in your mean reviews of my book. Like, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. Like, this is why I don't read Amazon or Goodreads reviews. Like, if people don't like my books, that's fine. I just don't need it coming through my window.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to protect yourself and your creativity. You mentioned this period of time between when you send your manuscript in and you get your suggested edits or questions from your editor. And so the significant period of time. What are you doing? What are you doing during that time?
I mean, in an ideal world, you're starting a new project. My agent has always been like, the best thing you can do is just have something new going so you don't get bogged down in exactly this, like the publication, which is also can be, if it goes well, can really be pretty weird. So I'm just to backtrack briefly and then come back to that. With seating arrangements, as I mentioned, I guess I didn't do much while I was waiting for notes, but then I wrote Astonish Me kind of at the tail end of that editorial cycle, which was terrific. That was great. I wish I could do that every time. with Great Circle too, part of what was tricky about it was because it was successful. I talked about that book for a year. I kept a loose count, and I think I did 150 on the record conversations, including, you know, podcasts, book events, and it was still COVID. It came out in May 2021. And so for my previous books, I had traveled, you know, and done in-person events. And this was just like Zoom events, which in some has advantages. You know, I could do 3 bookstores in 3 states in one day, but it meant I was just staring into my computer, and you don't get any sort of human energy, and that pace is intense. So it also became just this weird feeling of saying the same thing over and over and over again in the same words. And it can be really sort of calcifying and makes it very difficult to work. So my agent's right, like that magical window where you're sort of done with something, but you're kind of free is really worth exploiting if you possibly can.
So what does it mean to you that you had that many events? Is it just the exhaustion, or like the you know, stamina that you needed to get through that? Or does it mean that book did better in your perception than others because it had such longevity in terms of interest like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly my most successful book, even just in terms of sheer numbers of the copies sold. And yeah, like going to London and doing the Booker Prize is a big deal. I'm sort of higher profile in the UK than here for some reason, which is fine.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so my publisher there had a lot for me to do. It's a really mixed bag. It can be exhausting and weird and make you sort of self-absorbed for a while. But of course, it's also meaningful. It does mean your book is connecting with people and people are reading it. And all my books, I've had memorable moments where someone will say, this really clarified something in my own life for me, or this really touched me, or this inspired me to do something. And the timing of Great Circle coming out during COVID, as COVID was starting to wane a little bit, I think too, people were really thinking of like, where do I want to go? And that's part of what the book is about. What do you want to see in your life? Like, what's important to you? And it doesn't have to be the South Pole. It could be something close to home. But I think part of what's in the book is like, well, go do it. You never know. And I think that occurred to a lot of people during COVID. It just seemed like, oh, we'll always be able to go do this thing. And then it's like, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a real mix of really meaningful encounters with people and readers, and also just a bit of drudgery talking about it.
I appreciate the way that you framed that, because one of my questions for you is, what about this endeavor brings you joy? Like, why are you doing this? What do you hope? When you publish a book, what do you want? What do you get out of it? Yeah,
that's a good question, and the answer really evolves, and it's a question I ask myself. Like I said, I didn't have this long burning dream to be a writer, but now it's an integral part of my life, and it is my source of income. So to a degree, it's a job. Like I write to make money. I find joy I do find joy in the writing. I like the puzzle solving aspect of it. Great Circle, there were moments of sheer abject misery. It was so hard. And just, it was too big to hold in my brain, So I was always having to like go back and reread and be like, oh yeah, like I'd established these weird threads. But when sometimes I'd make a connection, like I'd hit a problem late in the manuscript and find the solution early. And it's like my brain sort of planted it there or something. And that cool. Felt great. The research could be a drag, but was also fascinating. I felt like I learned so much, and sort of, it also really expanded my life. Just the way I started travel writing more changed so much about the way I experience the world and the places I've seen. So it was as a book, it was just a real game changer for me. And also I think, I don't have kids, but I do think there's a little bit of a childbirth aspect of it where like the experience of birthing the book is not always great, but then you have this beautiful finished book and you're like, oh no, it wasn't that bad. I wasn't totally despairing,
That's
It's just
amazing.
easy to forget the hard parts, I think.
Well, I have two more questions for you, and then we can wrap up unless you have anything else that you want to talk about. One of which is, I mentioned earlier, I kind of made some comparisons from my own reading background about kind of the experience that I had reading this book being very much like a Steinbeck's East of Eden or like a Mishner saga. I'm wondering, are there any particular authors that you draw inspiration from or you model your work after?
It's really book specific. So this book, I was reading a lot of long, complex books, mostly by women. I'm just looking at
Did
my
you have a
shelf to remind
favorite
myself,
out of those?
I love The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert.
Okay.
It's funny. It's not her most successful novel, but I think by far it's her best novel. It's so good.
Okay.
About a female botanist in the 19th century, or like The Luminaries by Ella Catton, Life After Life by Kate Atkinson.
Cool.
Those were books I would kind of have on my desk and go back to. Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. But yeah, it shifts kind of from book to book,
Okay.
what I have around. Yeah.
Now, thinking about, most of my audience are women who have a career in aviation or have some experience in aviation, and they have something that they want to convey in writing, whether it's through nonfiction and talking about their memoir or doing research about, an historical figure, or like you writing fiction. What advice do you have for them?
I mean, my first piece of advice is always to read, and read stuff that's like what you're writing. I think it's so essential, and I'm sure almost everybody who's writing does this. But for example, my dad likes to write fiction, but he will not read it. And so there's always a little bit of a misalignment. Yeah, I think that I find so much inspiration in reading. It always sort of knocks things loose. And then I think I said a version of this earlier, but I sometimes with creative writing, just the self-expression of it all gets, I think, a little bit overemphasized. Like, obviously that's there, but you are also trying to put that self-expression into a format that other people will connect with. And so I think there's this balance of giving yourself lots of room to do what you're doing, and then also bringing a strong critical eye to it and being rigorous with your own work, like trying to set some feelings aside, getting feedback. I think feedback's really important, especially if you're just starting out, because you need to see it through someone else's eyes eventually, like maybe not on day one, but down the road, that's crucial. So yeah, all the usual stuff. Just it's very difficult. And I think part of being kind to yourself is just understanding that it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And I think because we all use the written word in our daily life, there's this expectation that like, I should just be able to toss this off, but it's its own skill, and people do it in different ways and at different times. And so, yeah, just lots of patience and kindness, also rigor.
Also rigor, discipline. Hey, you know what, Maggie? I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to talk with you and to learn from your experiences. Thank you for honoring us again, Women in Aviation, with this beautiful book and all of the research that you put into it.
Oh, thanks, Liz. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you having me.
Thanks so much for listening. I'd like to thank Michael Wilds of Massif and Crew for his help producing this interview and his support of all things Literary Aviatrix. Please join us in the book club next month when we'll discuss the book, The Fabulous Flying Mrs. Miller. Blue skies and happy reading.